So I explicitly taught them that over the course of a week prior to this unit of how to formulate and write down an idea, how to incorporate evidence from the text that actually supports that idea, and then to interpret that evidence to explain to the reader that this evidence does in fact support my idea, ultimately concluding with an extension that basically tells you the point of why they wrote this in the first place. So what type of life lesson can they gather from this? So this was the writing unit that we did previously, and explicitly for the students so that they would understand how to do this type of writing. It was difficult for them at first, but eventually they kind of caught on, and now it's something that they are doing basically second nature. They have to do this now in this particular unit on a weekly basis. They have a list of text-dependent questions that are open-ended that they can choose which one they want to respond and argue. And each week when they come to the meeting that you just saw, they have to turn one of those in, and at that point in time I grade it and give them explicit feedback so that they can use it again to further improve their writing going forward. Before we even started this whole nonfiction literacy unit, we wanted to make sure that they were able to read this kind of text. This kind of text, if you just put it in front of a student, can be very, very challenging. There's a lot of graphics, there's pictures, there's charts, there's things in there that aren't just their fun fiction that they're used to reading. So at the beginning of the year, we start off with teaching our students note-taking strategies that they can use in all sorts of nonfiction texts. They're just ways for students when they go through short or long nonfiction texts that they can actively be reading, taking notes, and organizing their thoughts and understanding what they use. We do this at the beginning of the year to kind of get them back into the swing from summer, and also to give them skills that they can use in their other academic classes. So I also teach social studies, and when my students are taking notes in social studies, they'll use Big Fox, or they'll use the NKQ or the KWL strategy while they're taking notes in that class. And again, we did this at the beginning of the year in preparation, not just for this unit, but for all nonfiction texts that they'll be encountering. After we taught them those strategies, we also taught them to identify the structure of nonfiction texts. So they are able to look at something, and one of my groups was actually talking about earlier today the sequence of the text. They felt really strongly that the chapter 3 of Getting Away with Murder should have actually been chapter 1, based on the events in the story in the sequence that outlined. My students are very familiar with sequence and the ordering and the temporal words that go along with it and the organizational strategies that go along with it as well, because we explicitly taught those at the beginning of the year. So compare, contrast, description, sequence, problem, solution, the cause and effect. When we taught those to them, the students are able to identify them when they come across them in their text to kind of understand the way the author organized that text. And then they are ultimately able to put that information into an appropriate graphic organizer so that they can then use that later on, again teaching them the skills to gather the evidence that they need when I later then taught them how to write and argue with that evidence. So it's been an ongoing process since the very first day of school, since the very beginning of the year, to get them to this point now where they can be independent readers in my classroom. So when I'm out here with my meeting, they're solely working independently in the classroom. They're reading, but they're actively writing questions and answers that are text-dependent and using evidence to support their answers on that QAR, and then writing their extended responses, writing those arguments, and using evidence to support those arguments in preparation for the meeting. So they do all of that before their meeting. They come into their meeting, and for most of them, it's a piece of cake because they've done so much preparation that when they come to that meeting, they're just kind of boiling over with that opportunity. It's like, now I get to talk about it. Now I get to argue. Now I have something to say and somebody else to say it from. Or if there's complicated things like Brown versus Board that came up in their reading, which many of them had no clue about and still are shaky about, but they got to ask each other. They got to ask those questions, those clarifying questions, and then together they went back into the text, and that's so important with nonfiction text and going forward in the Common Core is to get them to want to go back into the text. So they would ask the question, they would go back into the text and try to understand together, what it is that they are talking about with this Brown versus Board. What does it mean? What does it mean for the character Emmett Till? What does it mean going forward? So those are, again, skills that we taught in previous units leading up to this particular unit, where now they can easily just come to the table, they're prepared, they know how to be prepared, and then they can verbally engage in those types of arguments going forward. I think some of them may have been confused in reading their QARs about time and place and what happened or who happened where. I think one of them actually thought Emmett had moved down to the South versus having lived in Chicago and was just visiting the South. And so some of those time and place things can happen, but I get the opportunity to kind of catch those either in their discussion or in the questions and answers that they write as well to kind of help fix those. But again, that's the nice part about working and conversing with their friends within those groups is they also get to help each other. And some of them will kind of catch themselves just by listening to everybody else. Everybody's talking about Emmett going down to the South to visit, and the student's sitting there like, ooh, I thought he moved. Well, now I know. So then now the student knows and can proceed conversing accordingly. They've gotten much, much, much better at posing open-ended questions. At the beginning of the year, most of their questions were just right there questions, yes, no, 50-50 response questions. And as we've been able to kind of tease that out in the questions that we've asked them, or the easiest way is just adding why at the end of it. So they'll ask a specific question and you look at them, it's going to be a one-word response, and they'll go, oh yeah, why? And then you ultimately have to explain it. Then it becomes open-ended. Then there has to be so much more involved to it. And throughout both of the separate meetings that we witnessed out there, 2 groups of 5, I probably heard almost as many questions posed as I did just connections made in conversation. So I really do love that they are comfortable enough with each other. At this point, this is only their 2nd meeting in this unit. There's 5 meetings. That they're already posing these questions to each other and they're looking to each other to help themselves to understand their text and come away with it with a firm and better knowledge of what they're doing going ahead. And then we also give them strategies that when they come across this word part in a word, to use what they know to figure out ultimately what they don't know. And that actually happened during my meeting today with the students struggling with the word taboo. They came across the word taboo in the text, and they figured they had an idea and they talked about it amongst themselves, but then they ultimately asked for my help. And instead of just giving them the answer, I almost always innately at this point respond to every question with a question. Okay, so it's usually a clarifying question. So what is it you're ultimately asking of me? And I kind of trying to tease out what have you already tried yourself? And kind of took them back through their own means of figuring it out. And to their credit, they had already tried some of the suggestions that I would have had, reading the entire sentence again and trying to use context to figure out that word. And I had the students do that, and they walked me through it because they had done it already. And then I asked them, based on the context of the sentence, what they thought the word taboo had meant. And to their credit, one of them came up with law, and one of them had come up with I forget what it was, a negative word of some kind. And then bless my heart, the next part was they flipped the page and found the word again and cited more evidence as to why they thought what the word was. Definitely wasn't scripted at that point, but the heart kind of palpitated a little bit at that one. So they showed me that they had looked at themselves, they tried to figure it out, and they just really wanted that clarification, I think. So when we went back to the word and they read it and they said, well, I think it means a law, or I think it means a negative word, and I kind of teased it out and said, yeah, you're both right. If I hadn't come here and I hadn't told you what that was, I asked them, would they have been able to continue on, understand everything clearly, and go forward? And they said yes, and then that was the point. And that's the point with this vocabulary. It's not, again, to ingrain a ton of words in their minds so they can just rock Scrabble going forward in their lives. It's to give them the means, the tools necessary to define their own vocabulary going forward in their lives. So when they come across things that they don't know, that they have the tools in their arsenal to figure out those things at least enough to get through so that they can get the bigger meaning, the bigger message, the bigger argument out of what it is that they're trying to accomplish. And this is so important for college and career readiness because there's always going to be times going forward in these texts where there's such a bigger message, a bigger meaning that we need to get out. And if we stop and stumble on every little thing that we don't know, we're never going to get to that point that we need to get to. And so that was a great mini lesson, a mini example there with the students. These are only 7th graders, but when you give them the structure, the guidelines for what they're supposed to do to run their own meeting, and you put that responsibility on them, and then you step back, and that is by far the hardest part, is stepping back and allowing them and having the trust and confidence in that they can do it, that you did prepare them enough, they step up to the plate. And every single one of my groups, my differentiated groups, even my lowest level, where my kids that need that extra support, they're in support reading classes, they have special needs, they still have stepped up to the plate and shown me that they can follow my structure, my guidelines, maybe a little bit more structure. I have to step in a little more often, but they can still participate and engage in this conversation by themselves.